Hello and welcome to this special conversation on the Middle East from Kurdistan's perspective. My name is Matthew Hughes and I serve as the Executive Director of the International Relations Council in Kansas City, and we are so glad to have you with us today. The International Relations Council strengthens Kansas City's global perspective by maintaining an active dialogue around world events, global issues, and their impact on our community. As a nonpartisan educational nonprofit organization, the IRC values informed civil discourse, accessibility, and substance as we work to sharpen our community's 21st century global acumen. We invite you to learn more about the International Relations Council, including other upcoming events and how to join as a member on our website at irckc.org. The recent history and trajectory of Kurdistan, the autonomous home of the Kurdish people recognized by the Iraqi constitution in 2005, helped to illuminate ongoing developments in the larger Middle East and the positions and actions of neighboring states. This evening, we are very pleased to welcome Bayan Rahman, Kurdistan Regional Government Representative to the United States, for a conversation to nuance the Kurdish experience, offer perspective on recent events, and explore what the months ahead hold for Kurdistan and the region. We invite you to be an active participant this evening. We welcome your questions through the course of the conversation using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And do check out and share other upcoming conversations, including The Ripples of Syria, examining the 10th anniversary of the Syrian conflict on Monday, March 15th, and the 2021 Berkeley Lecture on the Global Rebalance of Power with Secretary Chuck Hagel, former Secretary of Defense, on Tuesday, March 16th. It's now my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today's program, who will introduce our speaker and help us navigate the conversation. Mike Wood is a longtime member of the International Relations Council, who many of you will recognize as the trivia mastermind behind the IRC's annual World Quest competition. Mike, who has enjoyed careers in the Peace Corps, healthcare, and education, is a true student of the world and helps us be genuinely thoughtful in how we approach learning about the world. Mike, thanks so much for your participation this evening, and please take it away.
It's a pleasure to be here, Matthew. Greetings to all. Kurdistan, it seems to me, very few of us, or not many of us, have a deep understanding of the meaning of Kurdistan, a rudimentary understanding at best. We recall in 2003, the Iraq War, we certainly heard about the Kurds helping us so much, and we recall many other names in the recent past relating to Kurdistan. I'm sure our speaker this evening will allude to some of those issues and the current plight or situation being experienced by Kurds in three nations, at least Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and Syria, four nations. Guiding us through this journey this evening, journey of understanding, is going to be Kurdish Regional Government Representative to the United States, Ms. Bayan Sami Abdul Rahman, who has graciously allowed me to call her Bayan this evening. We're pleased with that. Ms. Abdul Rahman, Bayan, is the highest ranking Kurdish representative in the US. Her role is to strengthen relations between the two entities, the United States and Kurdistan, particularly to represent her government's interest in political, security, economic, cultural, and humanitarian areas. Bayan was born in Baghdad, spent a brief period in Iran, and moved to London. She's had a 20-year career, nearly 20 years, in journalism, working for The Observer and the Financial Times in London and as bureau chief in Tokyo. For Representative Abdul Rahman, Bayan, representing the Kurdish people is a family affair. Her late father was a celebrated leader of the Kurdish opposition to Saddam Hussein, who was killed in a double suicide bombing in 2004. Bayan, we are honored at the IRC to have you in Kansas City today. We look forward to your remarks. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Mike, and thank you to everybody who's watching. I appreciate the invitation, and I look forward to seeing you in person in Kansas City or here in Washington.
Please. We are particularly interested, I think, to start with a little background on how did the Kurds, the Kurdish plight, representing, according to what I read, some 30-odd million people with a unique culture, language, and how are they strung over the Middle East without a nation of their own? How did that derive?
Well, that's the biggest question for us Kurds. It's something that we have to live with. So Kurdistan ended up being divided separated into four countries, really after the First World War. When the Ottoman Empire was being broken up, we ended up with Kurds in Turkey, in Iran, in Iraq, and Syria. The negotiations after the First World War went back and forth. There was one treaty whereby there would have been an independent Kurdish state. It wouldn't have incorporated all of Kurdistan or all of the people of Kurdistan. But then that treaty was superseded by another, and the result is what we have today. So there are Kurds in Iraq, Iran, Turkey, and Syria, as you said, and the number varies according to who you ask. A Kurdish nationalist will say there are at least 50 million Kurds. Others would say only 25 million. My view, I think there must be 40 million or so, not only in the Kurdish areas, but for example, there are many Kurds who live in Tehran. There's 1 or 2 million Kurds living in Istanbul. So if you add everybody up, I think the population or the Kurds number probably close to 40 million altogether.
It would seem to me that, is there another group as large as that without its own independent state?
We are often referred to as the largest group without a nation state. And it is the dream of many Kurds to have independence, whether it's one part of Kurdistan, for example, in Iraqi Kurdistan in 2017, we did have a referendum on independence from Iraq, or other people want to have independence and then to unify all four parts of Kurdistan under one nation state. So far, it hasn't happened. What we have is autonomy inside Iraq. So Kurdistan region is fairly autonomous inside the state of Iraq. Syria, it's a kind of a de facto situation with Assad's forces outside of that area. Kurdish forces and Kurdish population are running their own affairs. In Iran and Turkey, of course, it's different. There is no such thing as autonomy for the Kurds there.
I gather you do not consider yourselves Arabs. You consider yourself a unique group. You have your own language, correct?
Yes, Kurdish is a unique language, but it's part of the Iranian group of languages. It's Indo-European, and I would say it's closer to Farsi or Persian, not Arabic or Turkish. However, having said that, we do use a lot of Arabic words, a lot of Turkish words, but then, you know, in English, sometimes you use French words or Italian words, but perhaps we use more. But certainly Kurdish is a distinct language, and we have two main dialects. There are sub-dialects as well. There are two main dialects, Kurmanji and Sorani. And my husband and I each speak different dialects, so it makes for a very interesting household. Oh, I think have I lost you, Michael?
We may have lost Mike for a second, so we'll work to get him back. Bayan, take us, if you would, please, to the foundation of Kurdistan as an officially recognized autonomous region within Iraq. How did that come about, and how did what led up to that, and what happened immediately after, if you would, please?
Sure. So Iraqi Kurdistan, well, Iraq was created as a state about 90 years ago, and it was initially under the British authority, and the Kurds were supposed to be partners. It was supposed to be a binational state with Kurds and Arabs and so on. But in fact, Iraq headed towards authoritarianism and eventually dictatorship under Saddam Hussein. And the Kurds of Iraq, we suffered enormously by being part of the Iraqi state. At best, there was instability and attacks on the Kurdish population, and at worst, there was genocide, and especially under Saddam Hussein. From the mid-70s onwards, Saddam had a program of destroying Kurdish villages, and by the time he finished, 4,500 villages had been destroyed in Iraqi Kurdistan. There were chemical weapons used against the Kurds repeatedly, most famously in Halabja in 1988. But in fact, Halabja, where 5,000 people died from the use of chemical weapons, that was only one of about 200 incidents where Saddam used chemical weapons against the Kurds. So this was our history in Iraq. Of course, Saddam was brutal to everybody, but the Kurds bore the brunt of his dictatorship. Then in 1990, Saddam made the mistake of invading Kuwait and was surprised when the United States led a coalition to liberate Kuwait. After the liberation of Kuwait, there was an uprising against Saddam Hussein. In the north of Iraq, among the Kurds, we rose up against Saddam Hussein. We believe that that's what the international community wanted, and that's certainly what we wanted. There was also an uprising in the south. Unfortunately, Saddam was able to use his helicopter gunships and military to brutally crush the uprisings. And don't forget, this was only a few years, 2 or 3 years after he had used chemical weapons in Halabja. So everybody in Kurdistan expected Saddam to use chemical weapons again. As a result, hundreds of thousands of Kurds, I mean, possibly 2 million Kurds, fled Iraq to the border mountains with Turkey and Iran. And this was, of course, a huge humanitarian catastrophe. It was March, spring, but actually it was extremely cold and people were dying of exposure. So the United States, Britain, and France launched Operation Provide Comfort. And actually this year, in 2021, we are celebrating the 30th anniversary of Operation Provide Comfort. This operation was able to encourage those people who had fled that they should return home and that they would be protected. And it led to the creation of a no-fly zone over Kurdistan of Iraq. This no-fly zone really was a turning point in our recent history. As I explained very briefly, our experience of being Iraqis had been torture, cruelty, silence from the world, genocide, and chemical bombardment. But the protection that we got from the no-fly zone, although it wasn't complete protection from Saddam, it enabled us to have the space to hold elections in Kurdistan region, which we did in 1992. After the elections, we created the Kurdistan Parliament, the Kurdistan Regional Government, and we passed laws creating various institutions. And that's really where the origins of Kurdistan region and the KRG as a government and our office as one of the representative offices abroad, this is really where we all originate from. And then if I can just leap forward to after the liberation of Iraq in 2003, there were discussions to have a new constitution for Iraq. And the constitution was passed in a referendum across Iraq in 2005. The Iraqi constitution recognized all that we had created from 91, 92 onwards. So it recognized the Kurdistan region as a region. It recognized our parliament, our president, our institutions. And within the Iraqi constitution, the region has certain authority and certain responsibility. So in answer to Matthew's question, this is really where the Kurdistan region originates, perhaps going back 30 years. There is a longer explanation that goes further back, but I'll stick with this because this is a more recent summary, a summary of more recent events.
Well, you certainly have a legal status within Iraq. How are, let's say, human relations between Iraqis or the central government? Is there a sense of acceptance of the fact? Certainly it's legal on paper, and you do have Kurdistan as an official autonomous state. Are relations good between the central government and the autonomous region, or tolerable?
Right now, our relationship with the current government is good. The Iraqi Prime Minister Mustafa Kazemi has the support of the Kurdish political parties in the Iraqi parliament, for example, and he leads a coalition government that includes Kurds in the cabinet. So we do support the Kazemi government. I would say the problem there, though, is wider than that. You know, in the Iraqi parliament, there are members of parliament who are calling for the dissolution or dismantlement of, for example, the Peshmerga, who are our military force. Or they're even saying that our offices abroad, for example, my mission in Washington, should be closed. Some of them, I think, would like Kurdistan region not to exist as a region because we have rights as a region. They would prefer to deal with us just as other provinces within Iraq. Fortunately, the number of MPs, members of parliament who have this view is a minority. However, the language they use is alarming. It's similar to the language that we used to use in the old days when Iraq was a dictatorship. But I should say that we strive in Kurdistan to have good relations with fellow Iraqis, whether they are Arab, Turkoman, Assyrian, Yazidi, but by faith, by ethnicity, we try to have good relations with everybody, even if the political relations sometimes can be tense.
You do.
I think Mike must be having difficulties.
We'll see if we can get things straightened out with Mike's computer issues. We apologize for that, everyone. Bayan, let me broaden the view lens just a bit, if we could, and sort of do a tour around the Middle East. Obviously, the Middle East continues to be a particularly active region with a number of challenges. And as you heard in the introduction, we are noting in March the 10th anniversary of the Syrian conflict, which has been particularly challenging for a number of different groups in that country, including the Kurds who reside in Syria. How does Iraqi Kurdistan view what is going on in neighbor Syria? And what insight can you offer about the trajectory of that conflict?
Sure. So for us, our fellow Kurds are our brothers and sisters, that we are one family. So whether they are in Syria, Iraq, Turkey, Iran, we are related by blood, by history, by culture, by language, everything that unifies a people. So whatever happens in one part of Kurdistan, all of the Kurds are sharing in the joy or the sorrow, are taking pride in whatever achievements we have. So with regards to events in Syria, certainly Iraqi Kurdistan has been impacted enormously. if we go back 10 years, 2011, when the protests first started and then eventually it became clear that this was heading towards a civil war, Iraqi Kurdistan received hundreds, or I should say tens of thousands of Syrian refugees. I would say really more around 2012. They were arriving in their thousands every day, and we were not prepared at all because we share the border. And of course, most of them are Kurdish. There are some Arabs as well, and some Assyrians or Christians among the refugees who came over to Iraqi Kurdistan. So we felt the conflict in that way. And even today, we have 250,000 Syrian refugees in Iraqi Kurdistan. And I don't see that they'll be going home anytime soon. Other ways that the conflict has affected us is ISIS. ISIS took over swathes of territory, both in Syria and in Iraq in 2014. And even today, there is a border area, not the Kurdish border area, but another border area between Iraq and Syria, where it's kind of almost an open border with ISIS terrorists being able to cross back and forth as they wish. So we are impacted by what happens in our neighborhood. We're very proud of what the Kurds in Syria have been able to achieve. They are running a territory within Syria. We would wish that politically they would be more inclusive of other Kurds, and this is a dialogue that is ongoing. But really, when we see what the Kurds in Syria have achieved in fighting ISIS, what they are achieving in terms of administering an area that frankly is poverty-stricken, but they're doing very, very well. I should also point out that Iraqi Kurdish Peshmerga also played a role, for example, in the liberation of Kobani. You may remember in late 2014, early 15, the city of Kobani was under siege by ISIS, and it looked like it was going to fall, but the Kurds there resisted, and we were able to persuade Turkey to allow Peshmerga from Iraqi Kurdistan to go through Turkey into Syria and to help the fighters in Kobani to fight and overcome ISIS. So we are impacted. As I said, we are one family. We share in each other's joys and sorrows. And we have a lot of internal dialogue. Sometimes, unfortunately, there is political disunity. And that's something that we need to overcome because it can be very, very serious and very damaging. But at the same time, we also have many ways that we support each other.
Bayan, thank you. You mentioned ISIS, and one question that I had that is related. Obviously, there are so many torments and challenges that have come out of the propagation of ISIS through the Middle East. One specifically involves World Heritage sites and monuments and historic locations. Can you comment on the impact of recent conflicts in the area on these places of global importance?
Yes, absolutely. I think this is one aspect of genocide that is often forgotten. Of course, genocide's first victims are the people and the children, the survivors of those who were killed, because they also carry the burden. And we see that right now with the Yazidi community, the Christian community in Iraq, who still carry the scars of the genocide under ISIS. But the other victim of genocide often is cultural heritage. So whatever faith or culture we have symbols, we have buildings, we have sites that are of significance for us, whether it's the tomb of a prophet, whether it's a church, a temple, or a mosque. These areas of cultural heritage are important for us. And ISIS knew that or knows that. And that was certainly part of their campaign of destruction both in Syria and in Iraq. So for example, in Iraq, they destroyed the Nur mosque in Mosul, which is, you know, a historic mosque. They destroyed many Yazidi temples and shrines. They destroyed churches. They destroyed many historic landmarks. What is being done now is trying to rebuild and restore some of the places that were damaged. For example, the Nur Mosque in Mosul, rebuilding the Yazidi shrines and temples, and also the churches. But also there is an effort to digitally archive, if you like, all of these cultural heritage sites as a way of protecting them and preserving them for future generations. But certainly the destruction of cultural heritage was a deliberate policy by ISIS.
And thank you. Let's turn our attention to the East, if we could. Iran has been a series of questions, I think, for the US around policy. Before COVID, which feels like a lifetime ago, one of the biggest topics of conversation was the death of General Soleimani from Iran, and the impact that would have on regional stability and US relations with the area. From the vantage point of Kurdistan, how does Kurdistan view what is happening between the US and Iran? What is the projection from Kurdistan's perspective?
Well, Iran is a very important neighbor for us. It's a regional superpower. It has huge influence on Iraq. And I would say that Iran plays a role in Iraq in terms of the economy, even security and society. So, as I said, Iran is a very important neighbor for us, and we strive to have good and normal relations with Iran. We try not to allow any country to play with our internal affairs, but to have respectful relations. With regards to US-Iran relations or negotiations on a nuclear deal, we would like the United States and Iran to have a normal relationship, and for Kurdistan and Iraq not to fall victim neither to a conflict or tensions or even successful negotiations. We don't want any negotiations between Iran and the United States to create victims out of us. We have good relations with the United States. We see ourselves as partners, certainly in the fight against ISIS and the security and stability of Iraq. We are partners with the United States, but we are also neighbors with Iran. And so we would want a de-escalation of any tension regionally, and we would want to have normal relations. And as I said, not to be the victim of either the success or the failure of any negotiations between the two sides.
Bayan, thank you. We do have questions starting to come in from the audience, and we certainly invite audience members to submit their questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. And certainly we'll turn back to Iran if others have questions on that. We do have some questions coming in about COVID-19. Obviously, that has been just a ravaging impact around the world. I think one of the first countries we heard of with a significant severe impact was actually Iran many months ago, but we've heard very little, I think, about the impact in Kurdistan in particular. What's the situation there? How have things progressed?
Well, thank you for that question. I'm just looking through my notes because I did note the number of people who had died from COVID. So COVID really came to Kurdistan, I would say, in February last year, and we were very quick to respond. We followed the WHO guidelines, and there was pretty much a complete shutdown of Kurdistan schools, businesses, very medieval kind of shutdown in late February last year. And the shutdown stayed in place more or less and was very well observed for a few months. So the number of infections and deaths was extremely low. However, by the summer of 2020, early summer, it was the end of Ramadan. It was the big festival at the end of Ramadan when people travel, they meet their family, they, like Christmas or Thanksgiving here. People, I think, by then were fed up with the shutdown. They didn't see people getting infected. Perhaps we got complacent and people started to meet and greet again. And so unfortunately, from around June onwards, we did start to see a spike in numbers. And since then, we've had lockdowns and then, easing of lockdowns, just like we've had over here and in Europe. By and large, I would say Kurdistan has done fairly well. Unfortunately, of course, there have been deaths and people with the infection, and some, I would say, high-profile deaths as well. For example, the governor of Erbil, who was fairly young, regrettably, he died from COVID. Very recently, a member of the Iraqi parliament who is Kurdish died from COVID. So unfortunately, we have had some very high-profile deaths. We don't have the vaccine yet. We are waiting for that to begin to arrive. And I've just got the figures now in front of me. So the total number of cases from the beginning until now is just over 107,000. The number of deaths is just over 3,500. Our population is about 5 million, including the displaced communities, that's refugees and other displaced, it's actually 6 million. So perhaps every death, of course, is tragic, but perhaps that's not too disastrous a number for our population. But we are concerned that the new variants are beginning to arrive now in Iraq, including Kurdistan. So there's a travel ban from certain countries in place right now, and the government is putting in the restrictions again. So we're like everywhere else, good days and bad days.
Bayan, one of the most striking stories I think that you've shared is, among many others this evening, is that during the Syrian conflict, Kurdistan actually became home to a number of refugees from neighboring Syria, which I think is just striking, considering what you mentioned earlier about the Provide Comfort mission at the end of the first Gulf War, and the important impact of that on the survival of the Kurdish people. Can you paint a picture for us of Kurdistan's progression through receiving aid to actually offering support to other people? Does Kurdistan's status impede it from receiving, for example, attention during COVID that other countries might be able to receive? And on the flip side, what are Kurdistan's assets that it's able to offer to others in need?
You're absolutely right, Matthew, that Kurdistan has really become a safe haven now for anybody fleeing conflict or persecution. Today we have about 1 million refugees from Syria and internally displaced Iraqis who are still sheltering in Kurdistan. Just a few years ago, when the fight against ISIS was at its peak, it was actually nearly 2 million. As I said before, our population, the host population, is 5 million. So providing assistance and shelter for another 2 million is a very big responsibility. Most of the cost of care for the displaced and the refugees falls on us, about 70%. The remaining 30% is really provided by the United Nations, WHO, WFP, these international agencies. And here I have to thank the United States, which is the biggest donor to those international organizations for assistance into Iraq. of course, including Kurdistan, and US aid, USAID is a very, very big contributor, and we appreciate what they do. But as I said, even with all of that assistance, 70% is still on us in terms of providing electricity, water, education, healthcare, and so on. And these are people who either fled the conflict in Syria or people who fled ISIS. And in that category, I would put many Arabs. So there are many Sunni Arabs, Shia Arabs who fled ISIS, and many Yazidis and Christians. And for us, it's very important that those displaced communities should be able to return to their homes, but only when their homes and their villages and cities are safe enough for them to return. Unfortunately, right now, that's still not the case. So they remain in Kurdistan. And as our foreign minister or head of foreign relations says, Kurdistan has an open heart and an open door. And we strive to maintain that. The Iraqi government has closed, I think, tens of camps in different parts of Iraq and forced displaced people to return to their homes. They want us to do the same. We have refused because we don't see anywhere safe that those communities could go back to. So they're with us and they're part of us right now.
Bayan, thank you so much. We're getting some questions from the audience about the religious landscape of Kurdistan and the larger region. Could you paint that for us? We've heard a lot in the United States about the tensions sometimes between Sunnis and Shias. Obviously, there are other religions present in the region as well. Could you help us understand that a little bit further, please?
Sure. So the majority of Kurds are Sunni Muslims, but there are also some Shia Muslim Kurds. And then in Iraqi Kurdistan, we also have Yazidis, we have Christians from the Assyrian Church of the East, Syriac Church, the Chaldeans who are Catholic. There are Kakais, Shabaks, many different minorities who follow different faiths and sects. We're very proud of this heritage and we want to preserve it and promote it. So in Iraqi Kurdistan, there are TV stations that broadcast in different languages: Kurdish, Arabic, Assyrian language, Turkoman language. We celebrate each other's festivals and religious dates, for example, Christmas and Eid and the Yazidi New Year and so on. So we're very, very proud of that. It doesn't mean, I have to be honest, it doesn't mean that there isn't prejudice. We unfortunately still have people who are racist and so on, but by and large, absolutely the vast majority of Kurds are very open-minded and open to having different heritage and different cultures. And I think that's why Kurdistan has remained as the safe haven within Iraq for these different groups who have fled conflict for different reasons.
And thank you. Later this year, the International Relations Council will be offering a series of programs on women in global leadership. And you yourself, of course, are an example of a woman in global leadership. What are the opportunities for women in Kurdish society, especially in leadership positions? You talk a little bit, if you would, about equality there, please.
Sure. Well, I would say that Kurdistan, by comparison with our neighborhood, is more progressive when it comes to women's rights. We still have a long way to go, so I don't want to exaggerate, but I have to be realistic in where we are, and it's by and large a conservative society. However, education is open to women, to girls. I'd say about half of university students are girls or women. In terms of the working population, of course, the number of working women or the proportion of working women may not be as high as Western Europe or the United States, but certainly women do play a big part in the workforce. In terms of political representation and so on, the Kurdistan parliament has a quota of 30% for women. I know there are many women who are against quotas, but from what I have seen in Iraqi Kurdistan, having quotas in parliament forces every political party to make sure that they have women who are trained in policy-making, decision-making, who are part of the decision-making process. So having a quota in parliament is forcing the political parties, no matter how progressive or conservative, to make sure that they have women in their ranks. My party, I'm in the leadership of the Kurdistan Democratic Party. My party has a quota of 16% in the leadership, or 10% now, right now. We hope that that will increase in our next party congress. And we certainly have many women who are in leadership positions. For example, in the Iraqi parliament, the head of the bloc for my party is a woman. I believe for the other Kurdish party as well, it's a woman in the Iraqi parliament. The speaker of the Kurdistan parliament is a woman, and so was her predecessor. And in the Kurdistan regional government cabinet, we have 3 women. Of course, I would like that number to be much, much higher, to be comparable with the West, but we are progressing, certainly. We have 14 representatives abroad, and 2 of us are women. Again, the number should be much higher, but we are there. As I said, the role of women in society is much more visible than other areas of our, let's say, our neighborhood.
Thank you. It's an important insight, and I appreciate your sharing that with us. Another group that's really important to look at in any society, but especially society in healing, is young people. Young people have played a very active role in the Middle East for many years, and we've seen that coming out of the Arab Spring and other more recent events in the Middle East, that young people have found new and different ways to connect through social media, through different movements. How do young people see what is going on in Kurdistan and the larger region, and what gives them hope? What sort of track are they on to make a meaningful change in society?
It's a very good question, because we have a very young population, like most of the Middle East. You know, we have a high fertility rate or birth rate, and so the number of young people is very high, which makes for a very vibrant, exciting society. But it also means that there are challenges in terms of jobs and creating an economy that provides opportunities for the young people. That is certainly our challenge today. Having been in this war against ISIS, which was very costly for us in terms of the lives that were lost and the injured among our Peshmerga, but also in terms of the economic burden. In 2014-15, suddenly we were fighting ISIS. We received nearly 2 million refugees and IDPs, and the oil price crashed. So that created an economic crisis for us. We were just beginning to recover from that when COVID-19 came in 2020. So we're again in a very difficult economic situation, and that unfortunately does impact our youth. And perhaps the United States and other countries are suffering the same because of, excuse me, because of COVID-19. So that's our big challenge. However, we do have a nascent kind of entrepreneurial group that's just beginning in Kurdistan. And there's one company that I like to mention because I think it's very exciting. It's a company called Lazoo, which is similar to Grubhub and Deliveroo in Britain and Uber Eats, that kind of thing. And this was started by 2 young Kurds to deliver food. Now during COVID-19, they're delivering many other things. They're delivering groceries. They're even pick up your prescription from the pharmacy and so on. And they're expanding, or looking rather to expand, in the rest of Iraq. So there is that also that dynamic. One other point on young people that I'd like to mention, which is really the connection that we want to create between the young Kurds in the diaspora and young Kurds back home. And we're fortunate that we live in the age of the internet, that we're able to do that. But there, for example, there are many Kurdish Americans, including in Missouri, who are very proud of being American, but also very proud of their Kurdish heritage and want to connect with young Kurds back home.
And thank you. And speaking of that, speaking of the opportunities that exist there, what trends are you seeing with people leaving Kurdistan for elsewhere, or coming back to Kurdistan perhaps after a period of being elsewhere? Can you give us a sense of the movement of people, please?
Well, when times are tough, when the economy is so challenging, certainly people are tempted to leave and, you know, go elsewhere. But what happened really was, after the liberation of Iraq in 2003, many Kurds did go back. People were going back even in the 90s when we had the no-fly zone protecting Kurdistan. But after 2003, Kurdistan really flourished. We created 2 airports, international airports, and today, from the heart of Europe, except for COVID restrictions, I'm setting that aside, you would normally be able to fly, for example, from Vienna, Austria, direct into Erbil, from Frankfurt in Germany, from Stockholm, you can fly direct into Erbil or Suleimania, the 2 international airports. In that period after 2003, we also created an oil industry from scratch. So that attracted a lot of Kurds to leave Europe or even the United States to go and work in Kurdistan. Several of our ministers, cabinet ministers, over the past 15 years or so, have been Kurds who lived abroad in Britain or Sweden or Germany, and then went back and you know, tried to help with the new situation. So the migration has been both ways, but certainly when the economy is challenging, people naturally want to go elsewhere.
And thank you. An ongoing question for many in the United States has been the continuation of a U.S. military presence in countries around the world. Can you give us a sense of how the U.S. military has been viewed by people in Kurdistan? And especially with the recent discussions of the troop drawdown, are there any security concerns? Are there any lingering concerns with what might be possible with the US's exit?
Well, we have really seen ourselves as partners with the United States. The Kurdish Peshmerga were the only Iraqi force that helped Americans liberate Iraq. And we were very proud to be part of the liberation that removed Saddam Hussein, who had committed genocide against our people and against others in Iraq. And we're very proud of that partnership. We're proud that we're partners with the United States and the coalition in the defeat of the ISIS caliphate. And today, even today, we work hand in hand to make sure that the remaining ISIS terrorists will not be able to regain or resurge in the way that they did before. We do appreciate the role of the US forces and coalition in training, equipping, and also supporting the operations against ISIS. Today, there are 2,500 American troops in Iraq, including Kurdistan. The number was double that a few years ago. It's natural, I think, that the United States would reduce the number of troops when ISIS is not the threat that it was, let's say, in 2015 or 16. However, we believe it's important that US troops should remain. We're not quite out of the woods yet. And the US troops are there at the invitation of the Iraqi government. But just last week, it was announced that NATO would increase its presence in Iraq by a few thousand. We don't really know what that will look like, to be honest, which countries will contribute to that presence. Again, this is at the invitation of the Iraqi government, and we welcome that. We believe that Iraq still needs international support to maintain stability and security.
And thank you. Obviously, we have moved into a new administration in the United States. We have seen a shift of policy and perspective from the new administration. What does the Kurdistan Regional Government anticipate from the new administration in terms of relations with the region, and what sort of aspirations are there with the new chief executive in the White House?
Well, we're very fortunate that President Biden is no stranger to Kurdistan and Iraq. When he was senator, he actually addressed the Kurdistan parliament. I believe it was in 2002. And as vice president, he visited Baghdad and Erbil many, many times and received our leaders here in Washington. So we feel confident that he understands the dynamics of Kurdistan region, Iraq, the neighborhood. His 40 years in foreign policy will speak to that. But there are many others also in the Biden administration who are similarly very familiar with the issues. Secretary Blinken, Secretary Lloyd Austin, who was head of CENTCOM, and I had the honor of meeting him and Secretary Blinken when they were in the Obama administration. And then there are many others like Brett McGurk, who is now in the National Security Council, and so on. So from that point of view, we feel confident that although this is a new administration, there are many who are very, very familiar with the issues and the concerns that we have. There is currently a review of the US troop posture in Iraq and elsewhere. So we wait to see what decision is made as a result of that. We see ourselves, as I said before, as partners with the United States. And certainly in the conversations that we've had so far, and it's early days, but even in the conversations that I've had with the White House, the State Department and the DoD, it's clear that we see each other as important partners, and we want to maintain the good relationship that we've had already with the United States.
What opportunities does Kurdistan see in the days ahead? What are the aspirations of the Kurdistan Regional Government?
Well, we would want a strong Kurdistan region. We would like our friends in the international community to protect the Kurdistan region. We are a factor for peace and stability within Iraq. Kurdistan region is the most stable part of Iraq. Of course, there are attempts to change that, but we will resist that with everything. And we expect our friends and partners to support that as well. We also would like the United States and our international friends to pay attention to Iraq. It's very easy for the international community to say, oh, well, we're tired of these endless wars. And although I would argue it's not a war in Iraq, and the majority of the fighting against ISIS was done by the Peshmerga and Iraqi security forces. And the coalition actually, of course, was critical and essential to the fight against ISIS, but we were the boots on the ground. So I would ask that the coalition stay the course, NATO play a role, but also our friends in the United States, the American public. We are your friends in the Middle East. We are your partners in the Middle East. And so far it's been very successful. We share values with you. We believe in democracy. We believe in religious freedom. We believe in diversity. And I think there's a great deal that we can learn from each other.
And Bayan, that sounds like a perfect note on which to end our conversation this evening. We are so grateful to you for your time and insight. What an enlightening discussion we've had, and we're truly appreciative of all that you brought to our community here in Kansas City.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and unfortunately, I think Michael's Wi-Fi or something was not working, so please convey my regards to him, and I enjoyed speaking to him earlier. And thank you again for inviting me, and I do hope I will be able to visit Kansas City, and if not, I hope I will see you and your members in Washington.
Absolutely, we appreciate it. And everyone, thank you for joining us this evening. We do invite you to check out more about the International Relations Council on our website at irckc.org. We wish you a pleasant evening, and we look forward to seeing you again very soon. Good night.